The tempo is something that, for a conductor, is the backbone of the structure of the piece. Conceptualizing it but not performing it physically, implementing it, impulsing it, always thinking forward, grouping the bars in hypermeters and preparing the anticipated transitions of tempi so that they can be anticipated and smooth depending of the texture of the orchestration. Whenever a performer on the piano has to play everything, which in the orchestra is often fragmented into woodwinds, strings, brass combination or tutti, with solo elements as well regarding of the thematic and motivic materials, but you're busy playing all. And so at some point, the concept of the pulse, the flow of the events in terms of the tempo becomes something of finger memory, depending also if the action of the piano is perceived as heavier than on others, and if the acoustics enhance that resonance or not, in terms of the fight with the decay of the sound that is always the pianist's karma. Ultimately, we all idealize the sound of the piano, but is not sustained by vibrato, is not sustained by the air column of wind players or singers. So the other structural elements inhabit the energy pattern that gives a continuous life to the held sounds. In a way, the busyness of the one bridges the held decaying sounds of the other in a general motion. And then that's why the tempo is so important, because composers wrote in notation cut time or 4/4, or they notate it in 3/8 or 3/16 or 3/4 or 3/2. It's common to assume that the tempo can be defined by the meter in the choice of the notation, but more often than less, it's misguiding, because sometimes the genre calls for a certain tempo. So if Bach writes a courante in half notes, in quarter notes or eighth notes as principal elements of his notation for the pulse, the flow, because it's a dance, or stylized but still a dance, then the meter notation influences less. Of course, with the metronome marketed by Melzel in 1815 in Vienna, the objective fact of the beats per minute defined the tempo. And paradoxically, Beethoven marking retroactively tempi of his metronomic, so symphonies written before 1815, appear to many conductors as overfast. So is it because he notated the pendulum's weight above or under on the grading scale of the metronome, the kind that looks like a pyramid, the mechanical one, obviously? Or was it because of this idealization of the sound that he had in his head, deaf more than before, but still I think he was anyway internalizing the music even when he wasn't deaf, and the feasibility of the orchestral possibility for scherzi tempi, for instance, appear too fast, while objectively chosen by the composer, which is our quest always. What is the composer wanted? So through the notation, or through the pulse, through the phrasing, through the texture, through the groupment of bars for the structure of the statements of the storytelling, You have run-on sentences, you have short declamations, you have Haydn proceeds always very structurally, and early Beethoven by groupment of bars that are predictable, so that we have this sense of organized chaos of nature by the desire of mankind, a bit like the philosophy and led to the architecture to have this symmetry and this organization of the gardens of the palaces in the 18th century in Europe that are very much geometrically organized. And all that is control over the, or then an illusion of freedom when you have uneven measures to write, like 7/8, or and gives that sense of unbalanced pulse that is more like spoken prose rather than organized syllables in rhymes in poetry. The music of the words itself, but then when you don't have the words, but the suggestion of the words in the stylized music that imitates the dances in the Baroque or the arias or the singing in the classical, into the romantic especially. So the dancey and the singy are part of the singing elements of the piano, which by essence is a percussive instrument with decaying resonance. Perhaps the pedal can add a little bit of prolongation of the sound, but to the detriment of the intensity of the harmonics embedded in the chosen notes. Since you lift all the dampers, then you have a resonance by sympathy of other strings, which gives a richness of the tone and certain homogeneity on the 88 keys of a modern piano for each of the ranges, which they didn't have on the straight-strung pianos in Beethoven's time. And therefore, a lot of the 18th into the especially 19th century fortepiano music, or to date played on the piano mostly, not only, but also. I know that early music specialists play on specific instruments corresponding to what was written for, provided we have the same ear and hearing. In acoustics, which also implements questions about the tempo, because in the context or outside of the context, a pure pulse or just the resonance of the pulse. But anyway, the left hand of the piano writing of Beethoven, Schumann, Schubert, has a lot of octaves because of this kind of orchestral strings, cello double bass octave depth of the orchestral effect that they obtained, which on the piano they must have missed because the straight-strung bass strings were not resonating by sympathy with the mid-range as they do today. And therefore, now today, paradoxically, then the left hand is over louder than the right hand when it was to balance with the octave. And I must say that if you voice the octave, then you can rebalance with the right hand on the modern piano by playing more the thumb than the pinky. But you cannot change the texture and say, okay, now on this piano with the straight strings that are no more but cross strings, I don't need to octave the basses. But you cannot change the text. You serve the text. And there is a decision made by the composers that corresponded to their instrument, obviously, but not necessarily only. In the spread dispositions, tenths with thirds or fourths or fifths inside, which are intended to be arpeggiated or broken by interval. The composers don't specify. They sort of say, like Beethoven in his late sonatas, as if he tells the pianist, and I feel it as the hyphen between him and the student, go figure it out how to deal with it, because you have to, if you arpeggiate or you break, you have to choose if you do it before the beat so that you don't, again, speaking of tempo and pulse, don't break the structure of the statement in terms of the pulse and the beats. Because inevitably then you stretch and you add, so then you become rubato. And the rubato is never meant in the composer's language. It's sort of suggested rhythmically if you go from 4/8 notes to triplets of quarter notes to eighth notes by two. And Beethoven does that somehow often. Whenever Bach was going mostly from the double to the simple, Beethoven goes to the triplet. So it's a rhythmically controlled in the notation rubato in a sort. But then the pulse has to go by half notes if you have triplets of quarter notes, and eighth notes, especially the Alberti basses, they can flow by 4 or 8. And it doesn't really matter because ultimately, as I say factually, the pianist has to play all the elements, the syncopations, the overlappings, the shiftings, and not miss the bass, and have the accompaniment or the secondary voice, and the thematic material, and the pulse, all kept in a certain flow of the storytelling. The stream never stops. With breaths, with psychological or harmonic breaths, or breathing for the phrasing of the imitation of the sung melodic line, instrumental or meant to be vocal with imaginary lyrics, for the articulation with groupments of notes by 3 or 4 in a bow, if it was bowed, in the group of a beam. And Beethoven often uses repeated notes under the beam, which makes us believe that sometimes he meant it in the expressive way, repeating almost like syllabically singing different syllables in repeated notes, imitating on the piano that single note, melodic repeated note, repeated within the escapement of the action of the piano in order to not have it chopped in the phrasing. In other words, the syllables are part of the word, which are part of the sentence. And sometimes the beam over it is a slur or a tie. And he sometimes gives fingerings, like in the scherzo of the third cello sonata. And so you know that if he changes the finger, that the note is not to be held, but it could be repeated. And if it's repeated, then it has to be slur repeated, even if it's the same note. I think all these elements of the fortepiano, which Beethoven explored since the late 1890s, when he started writing his to-be 32 sonatas at that time, he didn't know how many there would be until his death in 27. And even with the invention of the, or marketing of the metronome in his city of Vienna in 1815, he was, of course, obsessed with the idea that people will play what he wanted, and therefore the objective tempo of the metronome, beats per minute, defines it. But it's not also so objective than that, because it depends so much of the spirit of the section. Is it a scherzo? Is it not? And how fast or how playful or whimsical or jocative. Character has to do with tempo, not only notation of rhythmic patterns, as well as the structure of groupments of bars for the statement, the pacing of it. And I find very often that pianists have a good intent to start at tempo and then they slow down because so much is to be dealt with. And if it's rushed, it's missed. And if it's anticipated in the shifting, then it's not missed. But then you have to be counting loud voice to make sure when you practice that you don't shift and play upon landing, but you shift, touch, and then you play. Therefore, you have to separate the count like a conductor from the playing, because if not, the shifting becomes its own space between the beats, sort of choreographic landing on the notes with semicircles when you go from one middle chord to a bass note in the piano's left hand, which is often divided into two hands, one for the bass line, one for the harmonic chord arpeggio, whatever pattern, plus the thematic material in the right hand through the motifs or melodic lines, one or two, and possibly a third middle voice in dialogue or in voice leading that reaches a certain balance of the two hands fulfilled with so many tasks in the flow of the event in an orchestral or string quartet or piano trio, quintet, chamber music to orchestra or concerto. You would have all these layered elements because you have so many people playing one part at a time combined. Whenever here you divide your attention to so many parts and you have to conduct yourself accordingly so that you don't play too early when you shift earlier in order to secure not only the precision but as well, but also the quality of the dynamic note that you want to reach or eventually voice, so that you have to practice counting loud voice independently of your playing. So if you play staccato, legato by 2 or by 4, whatever it is, the texture that the storytelling asks for, you have to have this independent count. That is what the conductor does with the pulse, while the musicians play the different elements of the music. And so because the conductor doesn't play and the orchestra musicians don't conduct, they rely on each other. Here you are by yourself, and when the stuff gets going, and there are so many things going on, shiftings and secondary voices and awkward dispositions in given tonalities, because composers like Beethoven really, as I said earlier, don't care how. Just figure it out. I'm not going to make compromises, if he says through his pages, jumping to our attention when we dialogue with how can we do that and what did he really want there to bring out or present. So I'm a hyphen between the student and the dead composer. As a performer, I have to take it in my own hands, literally, as they do. But each hand also is different, and therefore the acoustics a lot to do with the pedaling, mostly harmonic, because that's the essence of the pedaling. But when you have a lot of passing tones or semitones, chromaticisms or whatever combination of those, then you have to make compromise with the resonance unless you can use the middle pedal, but that's not always practical, nor was it meant. Therefore, there was some idea in the acoustic that some of the composers took in account the fact that on the piano you will have to hold with one right foot pedal elements that are held with elements that are moving and elements that are singing or thematically meaningful in the middle or the top, regardless. So you end up organizing your playing according to what you have to play. And then if you can objectively count independently, neutrally, staccato counting, regardless if you play legato or not. If not, you end up singing your count. So you follow the leash of the dog rather than control it. And therefore you should control your pulse by counting like a conductor while playing like an orchestra. It's almost a duality within oneself, because at some point you practice enough practicing. Well, depending how enough it's enough, not everybody has the same amount until the muscular memory triggers the performance of many sections that in real time in performance the brain cannot process. And then the brain processes where you go in the piece, basically the conductor. So it doesn't mean that you play with the autopilot in the orchestra hands, but sort of suggested. And there are always tectonic plates that can move from one transitional tempo to another, given the texture or the material of the music itself, or the overlapping of the elements, if it's contrapuntal, fugal or not, chordal, arpeggio. The perception is very different because then the acoustics in the hall where you play, the instrument's response that you receive in the feedback on stage doesn't always match the one in the hall, drier or wetter. And then the pedal that you use contribute a lot to the tempo choosing because you want clarity in the elocution of the elements that are there. But if you have eighth notes over half notes with quarter notes in the middle and jump to catch a bass and voice a melodic line with a secondary voice that plays between the two hands, a lot of things to manage, obviously, within a pace of the pulse, which by itself should be independent from all these elements of how you handle them. But it's written for the instrument, or like Beethoven sonatas often, I believe, are written through the instrument. So you have a quartet, an aria, a mass, a chorale, symphony, a tutti, a dialogue of elements in one hand and a melodic line on top, or in the development, the chopping of the thematic material so that you can bring in the unity of the timbre of the piano, which is not the variety of the orchestral timbres. You have shadows and lights, so you can suggest by voicing what is that you want to bring out in the contours or the essence. And you can change mind through time because sometimes it's about possibility, feasibility, how to manage, handle, literally sculpting the keyboard. And when the composer chooses the tonality, some of the layout of the keyboard is more practical or less prone to even misplay a neighboring tone if he uses white keys rather than black keys where you have none around. So you're more solid, reliable, and the unexpected of the performance moment is always not only the stage fright, but in part for some, but it's also the fact that you idealize so much the texture when you prepare it repetitively that you don't want to belittle it or mess it up, so to say, when you present it, because you want all the layers of the cake to match perfectly so that when you have the bite of the slice as the listener, you taste all the elements in the texture, the richness of the texture, or the thirds or the fifths, or the resonance of the dissonance. Every composer's language enhances one or mitigates the other, and you choose which to bring more because you can. The instrument allows you to make your own choice to bring out this or less that. So in a way, you suggest an orchestration through shadows and lights rather than colorizing, if I may say this analogy, the timbres. But also you play everything. Whenever in the orchestra, those who play some sections have rests for the other sections. So they all contribute. Here you divide your attention to so many. At the same time, you have to cover the flow of the events and therefore the pulse of the tempo, with or regardless of the acoustic, for the blurry or clarity of the elements, if the right foot pedal is obliged. And if you don't, then it's too dry, or you lose a bass held note and the composer didn't have a middle pedal, then even if you could implement it, should you, because you played on an instrument for which there was not written, but also the acoustics to hear and share the music in the salon wasn't in the hall, let less in the earbuds, today electronically, so that the presence of the sound, the resonance of the sound, the aesthetics of the sound, the expectation of the sounds, connection to the next, how you exit a long held value through short values without impulsing in unexpected accent because you don't take into account the decay. Even if musically it's not a decay because it's a tension release in terms of the melodic appoggiatura or suspension. But on the piano, it decays, and if you don't take it in account, then it gives a bump whenever. If not, you re-rise after you take it at the level where it decay, depending of how slow you play. Again, the tempo is also a question of the long values on the piano, and therefore how slow is an andante, how slow is an adagio, besides the mood, the atmosphere that you want to implement, because that's what it means to you as you read it and you want to render it for the audience. And then you idealize it, and you perhaps deny the idea of the decay. You're in a denial. But you have to take it in account in order to choose how you structure the phrase. Of course, you don't have syllables. You cannot breathe in the middle of a word when you're a singer if you run out of breath. So the tempo is a lot to do with the bow length or speed of bow or breath capacity for the wind singers or players or string players with whom pianists play. And you're by yourself, then you don't have to adapt to anybody's instrumental tempo decision what an andante is, a specific one. Here you can, with the pedal and the acoustics, eventually artificially stretch the tempo, even if the decay still arrives, but you delay it. But is it in the spirit of the character of this piece that you want to bring? And sometimes a slow movement that is not slow enough on the piano sounds like hectic, because it's difficult to control the evenness unless you take time for each note. So then you slow down to control the details, but then with the decay you lose the flow of the arch of the phrasing, the direction of the line, the meaning of the sentence. You sort of syllabically recite the notes, counting on the pedal, but it blurs because of the dampers up, or the acoustic, which could blur too. So between clarity and blur, there's some kind of a artistic midway that is acceptable in order to hold what you cannot finger-wise, as well as bring out in the elements what you think needs to prevail in the foreground compared to the background. Harpsichord organ dictate to you a lot what you can do with the texture according to what is their way of making the sound exist. The piano decay is delayed compared to the harpsichord, but is not unexisting like on the organ, where the sound literally connects to the next until you stop, and then you have a breath or a break, but you don't have a decay. And therefore, conceptually, the composers wrote for chamber music or mass with choir or symphony for the orchestra or string quartets or keyboard and combined instruments, with a texture corresponding for the expression of their musical ideas that corresponds to the combination of this sound decays, ultimately matching them. Therefore, an andante in a violin sonata with piano would be more walking forward in the pulse. And if you're alone on the piano, you could indulge, even if musically, artificially, not as natural as the bowing of a string player. You can play the same movement way slower. And it's not about fancy, it's not about superiority of playing slower or faster, because that is, of course, a question that is unrelated to the musical meaning. I think it's all to do with how much you control of what you have to play in terms of the finger touch. And then define if the technical capacity of handling it will then justify tempo that then becomes a devil's advocate for the interpretation by saying, if I go slower, I lose this. If I go faster, I cannot manage that. Regardless of how you hear it when you read it. In a way, some music like the Heart of the Fugue by Bach are meant to be read and heard inside yourself. Every time you render them with different idioms of instrumentarium, you're never satisfied fully because it's such pure music as intervals, lines, perhaps something more close to the vocal, but not necessarily. Well, you can, but people have arranged the art of the fugue for so many instrumental presentations. But ultimately, it's the beauty of reading the voice leading of this conversation among people well behaved who interact with each other among equals. It's polyphony in a way. Therefore, the tempo, unlike for the conductor, which is the, as I say, the backbone for the pacing of the structure in which you place all the notes, but you don't play them. Others deal with that fact. On the piano, you have to be able to have enough muscular memory developed for sections where you can not lose the tempo and go forward as if you sail through different straits. To be one's conductor and one's orchestra, and with the pedal and the acoustics and the capacity to manage the action of the piano on different ranges. Ultimately, you do make some kind of compromise one with the other in order to obtain the whole. And that whole can evolve because it's an ephemeral construction in performance that disappears as soon as played, even if recorded sometimes. At least then there is an echo of that moment. But it's never the same way as you felt it on the spot, because that's when you make it in real time, like live, not a reproduction. And even a repeat doesn't have the same meaning when you replay it, because you're not exactly able to do to the dot, well, some better than others in the among the performers can, but I still think that the repeat is not only a redemption for if something went wrong the first time, that's the joke, but it's also a meaningful restatement that confirms the thematic material, the transitions, and confirms the GPS to the listener, who then will follow better the thematic material's evolution through the development in the sonata form. So this idea of the recognition of the material, even if transformed as it is by the development, established by the exposition and restated in the recap with the tonalization in minor or major regarding of the principal key for the relative major second theme. Some composers restate in major, or some restate it differently in minor, so you have different characteristics for it. But you have to tonalize it in the sonata form, at least originally, through Haydn's establishment of these rules for us. At least that's how we think of it. And how the rules are broken by composers. To start with Beethoven already, the sonatas go from 4/2 to almost one movement, cyclic, like in Liszt and so on, or Berg and Scriabin, and they already use only the name sonata, not so much the classical Haydn form sonata. But nevertheless, the repeats come differently every time you play them, and doesn't have to be different by plan, like by saying I'm going to ornament it and play it naked the first time and dress it up the second. Not that kind. It's just playing through the same twice. It's a restatement, and it can have a different statement. The first time you discover, the second time you insist, and then in the development you literally play with it in terms of the intellectual. It's almost like crossword puzzle organization of management of the thematic materials. And then when you hear it back in the recapitulation, you feel like you're back home after you have left it, but with the materials of the exposition. And I think all this formal aspect of the music that we play within the structure that the composer chosen, like when you improvise open-ended or compose a piece that you plan the end of, but as an actor you display it as if you discover it on the spot, the rupture of disbelief. But nevertheless, there is what the conductor always oversees, because that's what is their main plan, is how to organize the pacing of the whole thing. And the pacing of the whole thing is its own traction, its own drive, on top of which you add all the notes. As Ravel used to say, reportedly, he wrote all the notes. No, he wrote all the bars. And then he said, I'm going to then now fill them with notes. First the structure, then the essence. I don't know if he really did that a lot or just mentioned it when he did it once. But it's a way to mention, in his opinion, therefore, that the structure prevails on the details. And but the details justify a lot the chosen note at a space which is after a syncopation or a triplet or delay, suspension or appoggiatura, and all these affects are not defining, but they are peopling the structure. That arcanes, the arcanes of which are the pulse, the beats, the rhythmic patterns within the structure, the rhythmic patterns being the melody of the beats of the pulse. And the melody on top of that is polyphonic with layers, and you can have layers of pulse with hemiolos over different types of pacing the pulse, implementing sense of faster or slower within the same structure, or then with the changing as the composers ask for accelerando or ritenuto. But how much? And it's in the good taste of the one, according to others, the bad taste of the same. It's a mirror in which you look at it and you decide, okay, this is too much, this is overindulgent, this is not enough, this is just enough, or I have to be distant from this. Sometimes you build your interpretation with the idea of not surrendering to too much manierism or too much emotionalism. I don't know if this is a word, but... And if you're only purely structural in your interpretation, then you have a certain detachment, aristocratic detachment with the texture. In a way, you're both. You're on the terrain and overseeing the terrain when you play by yourself. But you have to have on the piano the vision of it as a symphonic instrument by one brain divided into so many thoughts, to the point to which you can get lost in a puzzled breaking of the it's like fragmentation of the elements. Since you practice to learn it detail by detail, in loops, beats by beats, bar by bar, with rhythms or hold and poke or through articulation. So you go into the microscope of the detail, and then you have to go, when you perform it, into the whole, where you place all these that supposed to deliver according to how long it took for the muscular memory to remember them. And then the acoustics and the instruments, keyboard action, since we never play on the piano, on the same piano, we have so many subtle shades of emotional color, sound, painting landscapes to subtly implement in real time, ephemerally in front of an audience, on a random instrument. Some betray, some allow to go more in the subtleties, some either make you to play a whole, meaning the key is depressed but it doesn't sing or speak or resonate. Or the contrary, have unexpected accents because of the amount of weight that you put into all this very defined grammage of how deep or fast you depress in order to maintain a certain elocution of the sound without overwhelming the melodic line if it's indicating longer values, and accompaniment often, or secondary voice, could be in faster pace. I'm stating here a lot of elements that you have to manage, but not in real time because you cannot process all this. A lot of it goes into the muscular memory of the autopilot. But you do pilot the flow, the counting, and the direction of the line, and somehow it reveals itself at the performance differently than you planned, but not necessarily worse. As a matter of fact, even better for some sections and less for others. But in real time, you can hardly assess how it goes because you're taken in the detail of the performance. So it's your head is in the engine. At the same time, you have to think about being an aerial view of the track that you're driving in. This micro and macro in real time is hardest. That is obtained easily by counting separately from what you play in order to manage the flow while not depend of the textural differences. In a given fingering in a given hand position fits better than others, or a disposition to readapt the texture between the hands and take one hand for another at some point in order to manage it better according to not losing the pulse or not missing the shifting note, or in other words, multiplying your hands on the keys without the blur of the pedal. But it's necessary also as a color for the pedal, not necessarily only for the held resonance of the notes you cannot hold with your finger stretch. But it has both virtues or both calamities at the same time that it brings through the pedal, which in a way can cover up for mess or apparently, or blur the intent of clarity because of what you have to hold that you cannot. And then what is meant, accepted in the practicing, which is usually in a room that is dry acoustically, on pianos that are not very good. Then you play a great piano, but rarely only on the performance stage, that you're not used to it. And then in the acoustics, you're not always taking in account the acoustics as a feedback in your performance because you have to manage what you have to play. How much brain cells are free to monitor what's going on in the management of the unexpected on stage and have the spontaneity and the preparation, the flow and the plan conjugate together in a unbelievably unique experience that is ephemeral as soon as finished. It's like as if the painting fades from the canvas as soon as painted, which makes pianists very nervous because they could say, but I played it well the other day in this condition on this piano specifically came out better because this or that. And when you learn how to manage unexpected different pianos, with experience you manage to avoid some gaps or accents that you didn't intend, but not necessarily 100%. I mean, touch control has great qualities because it gives you a certain, and that's what I try to give the students, confidence by reliability on various instruments on which you have to play, and you never know how they're going to respond. But it's never 100% until you really know the instrument and the acoustic and you have time to practice on it, and you can then relax from the anxiety of will it go through with all what I would like to do in it within the tempo. That's why I think the pulse and the tempo are, for the pianist solo, related so much to the acoustic and the instrument handling, which then is coated by the technique of the muscular memory. It's fascinating to manage such symphonic amount of polyphony within a storytelling flow of the pulse that structures that phrase statement. Thank you.